So the other day I had an interesting thought. I figured that since Elden Ring has been out for a number of years now, and we've gotten so many patches, and even since the day one patch that came out, Elden Ring has only gotten more and more different since the time that it released. And so a couple of weeks ago, I did a video where I collected every single, Souls game collector's edition, and I was looking at my Elden Ring collector's edition, and I had the thought that, this is probably like a pretty old disc. Like, surely given how long ago the collector's editions were made, this has to be one of the original 1.0 printed discs. I'm not sure if they started printing any discs later on with the 1.1 patch installed, or basically like the day one update. I'm not totally 100% on that, but what I did know is that this disc inside this collector's edition was hella old, and I decided it would be a fun idea to try to play the 1.0 version of Elden Ring just to see how actually different it is from our current day build. And so that's exactly what I did. I went out and bought a brand new PlayStation 5 that's never been connected to the internet, and then I got this really old disc out of the collector's edition, and then I hooked it up, and then we got it running. And before I get into specifically what Elden Ring 1.0 actually is, it's worth noting that the only real way to play this now is to have a disc with the 1.0 print that's being played on a console that has not connected to the internet, because of course if you try to launch it with connected to the internet, it's just going to download the most updated version of the game, and we don't want that. So definitely have to jump through a couple hoops to get there if you don't already have a console that's always offline, or you don't have like an old printed disc like this. But either way, being able to launch this with Elden Ring 1.0 was going to be an experience, and I decided to go through the entire game and figure out the biggest changes from the old 1.0 edition to our current day version. Now, if for some reason you have access to be able to play the Elden Ring 1.0 version, I can't say I exactly recommend it. It was an experience for sure. It was almost like playing a totally different game, which was interesting in a way, but also at the same time, it's so clear that this is not finished. Like, this is just straight up an unfinished version of the game. Technically, it is complete, quote unquote. Like, this is a minimum viable product that FromSoftware could release, and technically it's in a playable state, sure, and all the content is completed technically, but at the same time, once again, this is not meant to be played without the day one patch.
And I've played some video games. I'm not a big video gamer. And I've played some video games. I'm not a big video gamer.
Now, it's currently speculated that the 1.0 version of the game was finished in late December of 2021, and then the day one patch would be developed shortly thereafter, a little less than 2 months later, and then meant to be shipped on day one with the game, and essentially putting a nice little bow on it and being the completed version. But you can still access the 1.0, which again is clearly not meant to be released to the wild, not meant to be played by the general public, but you get a very interesting look behind the curtain, and a lot of the things that you're going to notice are changed. Things like item descriptions, icons, ashes of war. Some of the bosses are different, even the way that the fights works themselves, the names of the bosses. There are so many crazy changes in this, and I'm not going to document every single little thing, because basically every item description is different from the current day version. So I'll have a Google Doc linked in the description if you want to read all of the item descriptions and ashes of war and stuff like that. But today we're going to be focusing on the most major and interesting changes from the 1.0 version to the current day build. Now, every time I show a clip on screen, I will be denoting which version it is, but at the same time, there is virtually always a visually clear distinction between these two games with the HUD. If you look at the top left here, you can see that, these bars are a lot more just flat and lifeless, and they're a bit more color saturated. Obviously, they don't have that sort of more like artistic effect that they do in the current day version of the game. Same even goes with the bottom left. Although it's subtle, you can tell that there is a little more artistry going on there. There's some attention to detail. These are just very flat and functional and to the point, which again is kind of funny because that's what this whole game is. It's not done. One of the craziest differences in the 1.0 versus our current day version of the game are some of the names of items, and specifically I'm talking about runes and smithing stones. So you're going to hear me use these somewhat interchangeably, but you can tell that the names of runes are very different in the 1.0. You have stuff like Pauper's Rune, which is like, the smallest version of them. Then you have Fringe Folk runes and Golden One runes and stuff like that. Like, they are clearly, this is not what they're called. And same thing goes for smithing stones. I actually found this quite confusing when I was playing the 1.0, because for example, like the regular smithing stone one, just the smallest, most basic version, is a smithing shard, but then it gets more complicated and the names get insane. And then when you add the somber stones into this equation, it gets kind of off the rails. Like, eventually you can get large smithing stones, hard smithing stones, large hard smithing stones, polar, golden, large, somber, golden, polar. It's just too much, man. It's too confusing. I'm very glad they went with the numbered system for these runes and smithing stones and pretty much every other item that functions like this in the game, because it's just not needed. And to my surprise as well, when I was playing the 1.0, a lot of these smithing stones, what made this even worse is a lot of them aren't in the same places that they are in the current day version of the game. So my muscle memory would take me to places to get upgrade materials, and then they just wouldn't be there. That's the same thing with like going through dungeons and caves and exploring chests. It's a very common occurrence in the 1.0 to open a chest and there's just absolutely nothing in it. Either the item doesn't exist yet in the game or it's placed somewhere else. But it's incredibly unrewarding sometimes to play, because much of the content that should be rewarding when you're going out and exploring the world just doesn't exist, and it's like, why? But it gets really weird. Did you know Malenia has a walking waterfowl attack that just got completely removed from the game? I mean, clearly it's hella janky and busted, so they just took it out, I'm sure, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But really, what I thought was just gonna be a fun little tour through like an early build of a game that I love ended up being a whole adventure that prompted me to make this video. Seriously, go get a snack, get a drink, sit down and get cozy, and join me on this exploration through the 1.0 unfinished version of Elden Ring. Now, the way I've decided to structure this video is we're going to jump around a little bit, but we're going to generally follow the progression path of Elden Ring, starting from the tutorial, going through Limgrave, and then all the way up to the very end. And in each individual section, we're going to point out some of the craziest and most major changes from the 1.0 version to the current day build of the game. Starting in the tutorial, the only real major differences I noticed is that these statues that allow you to summon things, which in the current day version of the game are automatically on by default, and I believe were also activated in the day one patch, need to be manually turned on in this game. So you'll see these statues, and if you want to be able to use like a NPC summon or, you know, whatever in a boss fight, you actually need to manually activate each and every statue. And it was weird because I've played this game so much without even thinking about these, so I kind of had to learn where some of the positions were if I wanted to be able to use them. It's obviously worth mentioning that because you can only play this patch offline, obviously there's no internet connectivity, meaning you're not going to be able to summon anybody or invade or anything like that, so all the offline functionality is also irrelevant when it comes to these. But the tutorial seemed pretty much the same for the most part. The only other real differences as well is that the finger severer that you get very quickly just before you enter Limgrave has a completely different icon than it does in the main game. One of the very first things I noticed in between these two builds is that the 1.0 has a lot of locations and sites of grace either mislabeled or they're like overlaid on one another, because like the Murkwater Catacombs, for example, has a completely different name when you like hover over the site of grace. It's very weird. And then also another kind of strange one is that they completely changed a lot of the wording and grammar of some of the locations and towers and so on. For example, I noticed that a lot of the locations had a different but still functional name. For example, there's this tower in Liurnia called the Proselytes Tower, and I believe in the current day version of the game it's called the Converted Tower, which proselyte essentially just means someone that like changed religions or whatever, and it's just kind of like an odd word to use in English, so I think they changed it to make it something a bit more approachable and understandable. But it's a lot of stuff like that where the wording on so many things got slightly changed but still functional, and that goes for Ashes of War, incantations, locations, you name it. Like everything has been retranslated a little bit from Japanese to make the English a lot more understandable, which I think is a good thing. The wording in 1.0 can be a bit misleading or confusing. For example, Scarlet Rot is pretty much just referred to as pestilence in this game, which is kind of strange. Also, when you have a bleed weapon, it says that it causes blood loss and usually gives you a number to indicate its strength in doing that. But in this game, it's just called hemorrhaging. It just says, yeah, this weapon causes hemorrhaging. It's like, cool. Yeah, technically that's the same thing, but it's just kind of interesting to see the original versions, and they do have slightly different lore implications. For example, Ranni's Rise is called Ranni's Glintstone Rise. That was a very common occurrence. Like every single tower in Liurnia was a Glintstone Rise, quote unquote, and that even goes with caves. Weirdly enough, pretty much every time that Elden Ring used the word caverns got switched to cave in the main game, and every time they used the word cave, that would get switched to caverns. It's really strange. Here's an interesting interesting one. The items that you need in order to upgrade your flasks are a bit different. Now, the only things that are still completely intact are the golden seeds. Those are exactly the same. However, the tiers that you need to upgrade the potency and, let's say, the power of your flasks, the sacred tiers that you get at churches, are actually just called flask tiers instead, which, you know, technically makes more sense, sure. Like, it's a lot more straightforward about what they are, but at the same time, I think flask tier just doesn't sound as cool, and maybe it doesn't really, you know, have any lore implications either. I'm glad they changed it to sacred tier. I think it sounds kind of silly as just flask tier, but that's something interesting to point out. Also, I noticed in the UI, you know, typically you'd have this like very subtle glowing dot when something is available there. Like, you know, if you need to talk to Melina, or if you have enough golden seeds or a sacred tier, it'll kind of implore you in the menu to go through that and upgrade your flask, but there's none of that here. You kind of just have to like click through and see if you have enough to be able to do it. In the early game, Rennala also gives you a Wraith Calling Bell instead of a Spirit Calling Bell, which is odd because in the main game, the Wraith Calling Bell is a completely different item that you'll get later on anyways, so it's kind of interesting that they changed the wording on that. Another immediate change I noticed was that there is a lot more references to Saint Trina. This is, you can go down a complete rabbit hole if you want to look at all of the item descriptions and incantations and armor sets and so on. All of these descriptions have been changed pretty much completely, and they either recontextualize a lot of the lore, add some additional context, or remove things from what we have in the current day. Basically, it's not at all the same. But one of the crazy things is that you're going to see Saint Trina's arrows everywhere in Limgrave, and even throughout, I mean, honestly, the rest of your journey. It's clear that Saint Trina was a lot more of a prominent figure early on in Elden Ring. Of course, we got to see Saint Trina in the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC, but in the main game, obviously, she's nowhere to be found. However, there are bits and pieces of her everywhere scattered throughout the world, and she's a lot more prevalent here. We could make a whole separate video just talking specifically about the differences in lore with the 1.0, and that would be a 4-hour video on its own. I don't know if there's any interest in that, but I mean, if there is, you can let me know. But either way, we're not going to focus too heavily on that today. That's outside the scope of this video. What I did notice also in Limgrave is that all of the misbegotten enemies, these are what they're called in the main version of the game, are called something totally different, whether you're in caves or you're fighting one, you know, behind Moonlight Castle in that boss fight arena. These are all called aberrations. Now, I guess that's kind of the same thing as a misbegotten. According to Google, a departure from what is normal or usual or expected or typical, and that is unwelcome. That's an aberration, which again is kind of interchangeable with misbegotten, but that's not what they're called in this version. However, the word misbegotten is still used to describe an enemy, but we'll get to that later. Speaking of Castle Morn, these stones, these like monuments that are right outside of the castle itself that have like this message on it, are just nowhere to be found in 1.0. Like, the message just isn't there, and that goes for all of the other stone monuments. I couldn't find a single one that actually had messages. After fighting Bloodhound Knight Darrowil, I noticed that Bloodhound's Fang, the Ash of War ability, is just called Bloodhound's Approach instead. Now, speaking of Ashes of War, one of the things that I noticed is that the entire icon for every Ash of War is a very different art style than what it is in the main game, and so you can kind of see them side by side. Like, the new versions kind of depict like a character doing a thing, and there's like a background with it, and usually the Ashes of War in this are like a weapon that's colored a certain way. I'm just gonna say it, I don't know if this is crazy, but I think I actually just personally prefer the look of the old Ashes of War instead, because I don't know, I'm just not a giant fan of this art style with like the character and doing a thing. It's not really my favorite. I like the more subtle look of, you know, these older icons. Obviously, they look kind of washed out, miscolored. It's just clear that they're kind of placeholders for the time being. They're not, you know, totally finished pieces of art or whatever, but I like the look of these, if I'm being real. It's a little confusing because while some of them are intact, a lot of them are totally different. So, for example, Poison Mist is actually called Imbue Poison in this version. Golden Parry, which, you know, you get from Leyndell, is actually called Erdtree Bulwark instead. Golden Vow is called Erdtree Vow. Sacred Order is called Imbue Holy. Shared Order is called Haligtree Vow. Barbaric Roar is called Brave Warcry instead. The Moonlight Greatsword is just called Sword of Moonlight. Here's a kind of cool one. Blasphemous Blade does not have Taker's Flames. It has Blasphemous Blade. And here's maybe the funniest one. The Shriek of Milos ability is just called Sword Art Placeholder 1245. Anyways, you get the point. You can pretty much go through the entire list of every single piece of equipment in this whole damn game, and there's maybe going to be some changes here and there. So once again, I'll leave a link in the description if you just want to look at them yourself. But honestly, for the most part, Limgrave seemed more or less intact to how it does in the current day version. version. Although I did notice over here that the rats, instead of having like the normal yellow-orange glow for the Frenzy Flame Eyes, they're just flat out red, and then the bar for Frenzy actually is just purple instead. Although, weirdly enough, the Death Blight effect, some of them have the normal particles, right? There's this kind of like gray and black cloud with a little bit of yellow speckling in there, but these basilisks that you can be found in like dungeons or just somewhere in the world that can, you know, proc Death Blight on you, they're actually like this big purple cloud, and it looks a lot more like the color of Frenzy, and I don't know if there's some kind of like miscommunication there. I don't know if they're got mixed up somehow. I'm not sure. But this weird purple effect is actually Death Blight, and then these red-eyed rats deal Frenzy, which is purple. I don't know. I don't understand. Last couple of things that I found noteworthy about Limgrave, despite all of the item placements being very different and some items just not existing, period, and having to deal with that, the chest that's over in the lake that teleports you to the Crystal Cave, basically you do teleport still, and the chest that's right next to you when you're done teleporting has nothing. It's like, great. This is so cool. I love this. Now, let's move over to talk about Margit, our first boss of the 1.0 exploration of Elden Ring, and he's kind of different to how he is in the current day version. Most specifically, his theme is not at all what normally plays. His music is actually Malenia's theme. Trend that you're going to notice as we go throughout this game is that one of the biggest differences in 1.0 bosses are typically their soundtracks. Either these were not totally done yet, or they just hadn't been placed in this build, so they used a lot of placeholder music, I assume. The reason we have Malenia's theme in Morgott right now is probably because it has like a phase 2 switch up once you get there.
Well, thou art of passing skill. Warrior blood must truly run in thy veins. Tarnished.
You know, once you start using his golden hammer, you actually get phase 2 of Malenia's track. But this is not similar at all to what plays in Morgott's fight normally. Also, his name is a little different too. It's just Margit the Fell. This is very different to Margit the Fell Omen, which would be included in the Day 1 patch. And also, what's kind of stranger about this is that even in the 1.0, the Site of Grace after you defeat him is called Margit the Fell Omen, but his boss is not called that, so I don't really know why the discrepancy there. And also, disappointingly, he doesn't say anything when he kills you. He doesn't put those foolish ambitions to rest. So what's the point of anything? This is ironic he has no dialogue because there's other bosses that have extra dialogue. Now, after that, we move on to Stormveil Castle, but before getting there, we talk to Melina one more time, and usually this is where she introduces you to the Roundtable Hold. Now, weirdly enough, the Roundtable Hold soundtrack is not the main one. Once again, like, this is what typically plays in the Roundtable Hold. But what plays in the 1.0 is a version of the Leyndell theme, which, in my opinion, just feels so wrong. I don't like that. It got to a point where it was actually kind of bothering me, not because I inherently dislike the Leyndell theme, but it just doesn't fit at all with the Roundtable Hold, and it was starting to kind of irritate me, and that's, believe me, that's not the worst offender of a bad soundtrack placement in this game. There's some, it's going to get crazy, I assure you. But all in all, the Roundtable Hold seem mostly intact as well. The merchants don't have quite as much in their stock. Some of the NPCs are a little different placements, but nothing too insane really to point out. Getting into Stormveil Castle, honestly, besides item placements and things that are missing, there really wasn't anything different to speak of, as far as I can tell. You know, the biggest changes are the fact that a lot of key items and just really good weapons that you'd maybe want just don't exist in the 1.0, or they're placed elsewhere, making Stormveil Castle feel very underwhelming as a place to explore, especially compared to the main version of the game. And even Godric himself, I couldn't really tell any differences in this boss fight. It felt identical and exactly the same to me. So so nothing too insane going on there. Actually, I guess one kind of fascinating difference is actually Godrick's Great Rune Tower. So when you obviously defeat him and get his Great Rune, once you go to activate it, on this bridge, you know, you pass all of these golems, and typically in the release version, the portal is just at the end of the thing right here, right? It's just right in front of you, and you can go right through the teleporter and then get to the tower and get your Great Rune. But in the 1.0 version, the teleporter is actually way hidden. Like, you walk to the end of this bridge, and then you have to kind of go down this like crumbling mess to find it all the way tucked in the corner. And that, I'm not really sure why they brought it. Maybe people were just missing this. I'm not sure. Maybe they went to explore this bridge, realized there was nothing at the end, and just walked away, just to make it more visible, I assume. But, you know, most of the other Divine Towers don't really have this problem or any kind of big change like this, but I thought Godrick's was kind of interesting. Now, before I moved on to Liurnia in this playthrough, I decided to explore a little bit of Caelid, and to my great disappointment, I realized that one of my favorite weapons of all time is not there, and I couldn't even find it in this version. You know, this chest right here that's guarded by the dogs has the normal greatsword, and in this version in 1.0, there is just literally nothing here. I'm not sure exactly, you know, if it exists somewhere else in the game. I hear a lot of this is because basically Miyazaki was paying a tribute to the creator of Guts, who passed away, and wanted to redesign the look of the greatsword, so maybe it's not quite in this version. That's entirely possible, but I couldn't find it here, and I was so sad. So after losing the will to live in Caelid, I decided to head back to Liurnia, because what else am I going to do there? But as I'm exploring Liurnia, I noticed right off the bat that the initial merchant that you see before you get to Raya Lucaria is just gone. He's just simply not there. This merchant is actually relocated a little bit farther on top of a cliff, which, you know, is not crazy different, but it's just like, why does this have to be moved? Like, I'm not sure why this merchant isn't here. It's such a good spot to have him, but either way, his stock is a little bit different, and there's some items that you can get or not get in the current day version of the game, so that's interesting. Also, something I found fascinating was that when you speak to the lady that gives you the Volcano Manor letter, in the 1.0, it's actually a red insignia, and I kind of got caught off guard because I was not expecting that, and I'm not entirely sure what this item even is. Probably some deep lore implications hidden in there somewhere. I'm not totally 100% on that, but either way, I thought that was interesting to point out. Another thing that was crazy about Liurnia is that when you go approach the dragon for the like the glintstone key that you need for the academy, he's just awake. You know, in the current day version of the game, that man is sleeping. You can kind of walk past him on your torrent or whatever and grab the thing and bounce, but he's just kind of walking around and patrolling this time, so that made it a little bit more difficult to grab the key and just leave safely, so that was something. As far as Raya Lucaria goes, it seemed mostly the same, again, other than item placements and things just not existing in the 1.0. That's a given for every single region in this game. There's just going to be items that simply do not exist, but besides that, getting up to the Red Wolf of Radahn, I will point out here in this boss that the only real difference to speak of is that the effects for his magic seem to be a little different, right, from the current day version of the game. They're a lot harder to see in this one. It just felt like a slightly more unpolished version of the fight, but still mostly intact mechanically. Pretty much no differences there to speak of. After the Red Wolf, you can explore a little bit more of Raya Lucaria, and once again, this was all mostly intact too. A couple different item placements, some things rearranged, but still more or less the same experience. Now, when it comes to Rennala, the biggest differences to point out in this fight are really nothing mechanically. As far as I can tell, it functioned about exactly the same even between phase 1 and 2. The real differences is actually the dialogue of the cutscenes. She has a little bit of different wording in the beginning, and then she refers a lot more to her children explicitly, and that was kind of removed in the current day version of the game for whatever reason.
Hush, fair maid. Ah, my beloved. Hush, little Culver. Ah, my beloved.
Again, maybe just a translation issue or something like that, but I did notice her dialogue was a little bit different than the main version. Now, but that's not all. Don't think that Raya Lucaria is disappointing, because there is one extremely weird change that I genuinely cannot explain. So once you defeat Rennala, you of course get the ability to then respec your character, and in order to do this, you need an item called a larval tear. Now, first of all, larval tears are a lot more rare in the 1.0. From my experience, I couldn't find a lot of the ones that are in the main in-game. I got a couple, but honestly, I don't think I got even nearly half of them. But despite all that, you need a larval tear to essentially rebirth your character, right? However, the prompt in the 1.0 says that you need an amber shard. And I was like, okay, maybe is this referring to like the starlight shards that you can pick up near those pots, like by cliffs and stuff? But no, it's not referring to that. And then there's something called like amber starlight. That's an item in the game, but there's actually no such thing as an amber shard. That's just not real. Now, for a minute there, I was like, oh god, I'm not even going to be able to have the ability to respec my character because I don't know what the hell an amber shard is and I don't know where to find them because they're not real. And while that's still true, the prompt accepts larval tears, so this is just mislabeled for some reason. I don't know what an amber shard is. That's one I truly cannot explain to you. So over in the village of the Albinaurics, when we're trying to get these secret medallion pieces for the Halig tree, the lad that gives you one of the pieces is actually in a statue instead of this glowing barrel. I don't really know why the change in model here. I'm not totally sure. Maybe to make it more visible and catch your attention more. I have no clue, but that was something interesting to point out. Also, the boss in this area, the Omen Killer, is just called Forsaken. That's it. Like, that's the whole name. And more so to the point, something you're going to notice is that a lot of the bosses use Malenia's theme as like a placeholder. And annoyingly, a lot of the mini bosses use the dragon theme, and the Forsaken is no exception to that rule. That's something you're going to learn a lot in this playthrough. Finally, in Liurnia, not only does this Magma Wyrm have the dragon theme, because of course it does, but it's also named Magma Wyrm Makal instead of Makar, which even the trophy says Makar, so I'm not sure why the subtle letter change. I don't really know, but I thought that was kind of cool too. Now, when it comes to Caelid and Dragon Barrow, honestly, it was mostly intact to the current day version of the game. There are some differences, obviously, like in one of these dungeons, the Magma Wyrm pretty much is instantly aggressive when he's really not so much in the current day version of the game. That's something that I noticed, but once again, with item placements, those are very different to the current day version of the game, but the level still seems mostly intact and the same. But when it comes to the main boss of this area, Radahn, I was very interested in this boss specifically because I just remember everyone ranting and raving about how difficult Radahn in the original launch version of the game is. Even with the day one patch, Radahn is still like, or was considered one of the hardest bosses ever. And I think where this came from was the fact that some of his hitboxes were really broken. Specifically, his meteor had like projectiles that would insta-kill you, even if you just got like minorly clipped by them. It was kind of crazy. So I think a lot of the patches to Radahn were just to fix some, you know, quality of life things and hitbox issues, not really making the fight easier itself, because while I wanted to experience the original Radahn, I was summoning some spirits just to kind of get some gameplay, and I ended up killing him on my first try without really wanting to. So I guess one of the immediate changes I noticed was that his arrows seemed to be a lot harder to dodge on Torrent, like it tracked a lot more heavily. In the current day version of this fight, if you're on Torrent, if you sprint out of the way of these arrows, you should be just fine. However, no matter what I tried to do, if I was on Torrent, I was getting beamed by these arrows, and it made that, like, that was the hardest part of the fight to me. So it became significantly easier once you just ditch Torrent and then just roll through the arrows instead. It was a completely different experience. But now let me give you guys a little pop quiz, okay? A little question. Whose theme do you think plays once you enter Radahn's arena? It's incredibly ironic and strange on so many levels given the lore of Elden Ring, and it even kicks into Phase 2 when Radahn does his typical meteor attack, so I think they just used Malenia's theme for anything that had a Phase 2. Other than that, Radahn seemed about the same to me. Again, I know this is like the unpatched version, and I'm not saying people didn't or shouldn't have had trouble with this one, but personally, I ended this fight a lot quicker than I wanted to, so I didn't get as much gameplay as I probably would have liked. Another thing I noticed is that right when the fight is done, as soon as you touch the Grace, the skybox flips from that red haze to this night, and there's no transition. It's just very jarring. Speaking of jars, Alexander's also here, and over in Dragon Barrow, you have like the big Great Jar, and I'm not sure if this is a glitch, but I could get him to like stand up and react if I damaged him in a certain way. Once again, don't know if this is really supposed to do this or not. I couldn't get it to replicate any other way, but thought that was funny. Now, before we move on to the Altus Plateau and the Leyndell Royal Capital, I want to talk about some of the other areas around Nokron, Schiefer River, Ainsel River, and stuff like that. Now, there aren't like a lot of insane changes. There's a couple funny and very notable ones, but for the most part, these levels seem pretty intact if they're missing a whole bunch of items. Here's something to point out. In the Deeproot Depths, this is kind of what the lighting looks like in the current day version of the game, right? You do have this sort of outskirt of this yellow haze, but in the 1.0, it's like clearly not finished. The lighting is just not correct in this at all. It just looks like you're sitting in like a giant fart cloud. This guy's fire breath attack has no sound, which is awesome. Also, if you get here using the tomb in Nokron, the Site of Grace that is usually spawned here in the Deeproot Depths for you just doesn't exist. You have to go up to the next one, so I thought that was kind of curious. But what's very weird about this is that if you fight Fortisax, his fight seems pretty much the same. I couldn't tell much differences with his boss, but the lighting of the arena is correct. It's like they made a specific instance just for this boss fight, and then when you go back to the main map again, it looks terrible once more. This was easily one of the most visible and obvious ways that the game is unfinished. You know, I can deal with items being placed in different orders and some chests being, you know, empty. That's fine. It's a little bit annoying, but clearly, like, the lighting here has just not been polished or completed yet. They finished it in the Fortisax arena, but not for the rest of this area, so it kind of makes this just look a little janky and bad. Now, when you get into Nokron, the Eternal City, you very quickly fight the Mimic tier, and I noticed this throughout my entire 1.0 playthrough. Whether I was summoning a Mimic tier or I was fighting this one, it would always spawn in with almost no health, and I don't know exactly when this got fixed, but it was extremely annoying if I was trying to use my Mimic tier for some reason. But even in this boss fight, it spawned in with like 20% health, and so it was an absolute joke. I don't really know exactly what the issue was there, but that was a very common occurrence every time I summoned a Mimic. Now, this is maybe one of the funniest changes between the 1.0 unfinished version and Elden Ring currently. Once you get down into Nokron and you get past a lot of the Nox and the Mimic tier, you get to these guys, you know, these sort of like interesting looking beast fellas. And in the current day version of the game, these beasts sing this very pleasant female vocals, and I'll give you a listen. However, in the 1.0 version, let's just say they make a sound that probably resembles a lot more what you'd expect an enemy like this to make. Yeah, it's kind of crazy, and it's way less pleasant to be down here for a long period of time just listening to unga bunga noises. It's not as cool. But other than that, I mean, this area of Nokron seemed about the same with a couple of like name changes and stuff. However, the other biggest change to speak of, I would say, is that all of the torches that you need to light to get to the Regal Ancestor Spirit are all intact except one. For some reason, there's just one random torch all the way at this bottom platform that you kind of have to go pretty far out of the way to get, and it makes no like sense why in context that would just be away from all of the other ones that are fairly close together. It was very annoying to find, and I'm glad they fixed this for the main version of the game. Weirdly enough as well, when you go to fight the Regal Ancestor Spirit, instead of playing like the Nokron more ethereal theme, it plays the Limgrave theme. So that kind of threw the vibe off a little bit, but I mean, the Regal Ancestor Spirit seemed about the same for the most part mechanically, nothing too crazy to report on there. But when we move down into Noxtella and then get into the Lake of Rot, there are a couple of notable differences here. First of all, beyond item placements, that's a given. There's a bunch of large, somber, golden, polar, somber smithing stones. You know, they're plenty galore in here. But the other very weird thing is that, you know, those enemies in Nokron earlier, like those beasts, they're down here instead of pests. In the current day version, they're a lot more annoying because, you know, these enemies can shoot this like web attack at you, and it's hella frustrating to deal with. But these guys don't really do that, and this is a completely cut enemy from the main version of the game. These guys do not appear anywhere else. However, the Scorpion Stinger is still in the treasure chest behind this. That's intact, but I don't really know exactly what the choice was to get rid of these enemies. I'm sure there's some lore reasons why that they are, but even this guy in the current day version of the game is not the same model as the ones in the 1.0, which would make sense, given this guy walking around in all the rot. They actually just cut this, enemy type and model completely out of the main version of the game, which I think is fascinating. But it gets even weirder at the end of this section, because when we go to fight Astel, in the current day version of the game, you walk behind this fog wall and you see Astel, Natural Born of the Void. And when we walk into it in the 1.0, we see Astel, Misbegotten of the Void. And that's where that word comes back into play, misbegotten. Once again, aberration and misbegotten are kind of interchangeable. Maybe there's some subtle differences there, but the fight is also a lot less polished, and I mean significantly less polished in the main version. Not only are the particle effects a lot less well done, but also I would very commonly have Astel just completely glitch out and then tank the frames on my game. You can't really replicate this in the current day version of the game, but this was happening frequently here. And also the effects on Astel's meteor are orange instead of the typical purple, which makes a lot more sense for the fight. That purple like ethereal space works a lot better for a Natural Born of the Void. But the worst part about this fight is not the glitches, it's not the unpolished effects, it's the music. And I bet you'll never guess what's playing when you walk through this door. No, it's not Malenia's theme, and no, it's actually not the dragon theme either, which gets spammed throughout the 1.0. It's even worse than that. It's actually the Tree Sentinel theme. As you can see, the music choice completely throws the vibe off of this fight, where in the current day version, it's a very low-key, subtle, almost silent soundtrack for this, which it kind of should be because it's so alien and foreign. Throwing the Tree Sentinel theme in here literally made me laugh the first time it happened. It was insane. But Astel's fight, all in all, seems to be pretty unpolished in the 1.0. Also, once you defeat Astel, if you're continuing Ronnie's questline, you need a Ring of Fidelity instead of a Ring of Oath, which I believe it is in the current, but that's a small little change. Other than that, the Moonlight altar seemed pretty much intact, and then finishing Ronnie's questline, it was also more or less the same. That quest seemed to work as intended in the current day version. However, I will say right now, the Moonlight Greatsword in the 1.0 sucks for a lot of reasons. Number one, the effects is a little bit different. It's kind of more of a greenish blue in this version. Also, the Sword of Moonlight is actually the Ash of War ability, and it's a little different, and it takes so much longer to activate the Moonlight than it does in the current day version of the game. Not to mention, the magic slices are horrible at tracking enemies. They don't go very far. They completely go over stuff. It's impossible to hit things with this. Also, it does no frostbite buildup, which is maybe one of the best attributes about the current Moonlight Greatsword. One of my favorite weapons, but it's just an absolute pitiful shame in the 1.0. Not worth using at all and incredibly disappointing. So needless to say, I decided to put this weapon away for a while. But moving on over to the Altus Plateau, after taking the Dectus lift, we arrive here, and this is where things get very different, because I feel like some of the most concentrated differences are to be found in Altus and the Leyndell Royal Capital. But for starters, when I went over here, I noticed that on the map, kind of near the the Godskin Windmill Village or whatever, east and west were labeled incorrectly, which I thought was just really funny. The Godskin Apostle seemed the same, and he actually has the correct music, which is a surprise. The Worm Face enemy seemed to have the correct black and gray and yellow Deathblight effect, but the Basilisks still have the strange purple. Not really sure what's going on there. Maybe, the Worm Face was updated later. I'm not really sure, but those seem to be a bit of a discrepancy. Also, when it came to the Leyndell Royal Capital, you can fight the other version of Margit that's just disguised as a normal enemy, and in this version, he actually drops you Marika's Soar Seal instead. And not to mention, the most laughable part of it is it plays the dragon theme when you're fighting Margit for some reason. I could not tell you why. I don't have much to say about the Draconic Tree Sentinel. It seemed more or less the same if the effects were a little bit unpolished, but the biggest difference is this lightning strike when he moves his shield down is heavily delayed from the current day version. You pretty much have to react to this immediately in the current build, but in this one it's delayed by almost a whole second. It caught me completely off guard, and so that made that fight, I had to relearn it a little bit. It was very strange, but that's pretty much it as far as major changes outside of that area. but once we get into the royal capital, here's where things get very weird. As soon as we enter, those bubble-blowing double baby enemies don't exist. Even that big one that's up on the platform is just replaced by like a big gargoyle, and so this makes this area a lot easier to traverse in ways because you're not being chased down by these bubbles that they spawn. Matter of fact, they don't really do much of anything at all, and if they do move, I had noticed this a bit earlier, but these imps don't actually deal blood loss buildup like they typically do, which, you know, makes them far less annoying to deal with. They're still kind of frustrating because they're so squirmy, but, you know, without dealing blood loss, they're not much of a threat at all, and so it made the Leyndell Royal Capital feel a lot more free, I guess. Like, I didn't have to be as scared and watch myself as much. Just the enemy placement being very different here. Also, a lot of the Leyndell Knights in the current day version of the game just don't exist in this version. They try to make up for it by having two of these like Erd Tree avatars on either side, which is somewhat annoying, and also when you kill them, they give you absolutely nothing. No Lord's Rune or Hero's Rune or whatever. They don't give you anything, so that's wonderful. Pretty much every enemy placement in this area was different. Even when you're going like up the dragon scale, this area where they can shoot arrows at you, they're just banished knights instead, and so you don't really have much of a threat to put up with here. It made this area so much more easy. Now, before we go up and fight the Golden Shade Godfrey, we're going to quickly talk about the Subterranean Shunning Grounds, because again, it's very different in terms of item placements and enemy placements and whatnot, but one of the biggest things that I want to point out in this area is that once you actually get to the boss, Mohg, number one, he's got a bit of a different name. He's actually Mohg the Fell Omen this time, which is, you know, kind of the thing that Margit didn't have, which is a little bit strange, but also his music is the Mohg Lord of Blood track. Now, there's subtle differences. The normal, like, Leyndell version, this just normal Omen, has like a subdued version without the vocals, so the tracks are a little different, but in this one, he just has Lord of Blood, and even with the Phase 2 part of the song, even though this Mohg doesn't have a Phase 2. Which is kind of strange, but yeah, that's something interesting. Otherwise, this area's got a lot of different item placements that kind of took me for a surprise, but other than that, seemed pretty much the same. Going over to Golden Shade Godfrey, also nothing really too crazy to say. He seemed identical to me, nothing noteworthy as far as different attacks or whatnot, so that's fine there. After Golden Shade Godfrey, I decided to go to Volcano Manor. After exploring Mount Gelmir, I noticed that the merchant has obviously different stock. There's item placements that are quite different. The Falling Star Beast has a completely wrong soundtrack, and then when I got to Volcano Manor, this was the first time I noticed this. Like, otherwise, what are safe spaces in the game where you cannot like swing or attack your weapon, enemies can just follow you in here, and look, I can't do anything about it. The game will not let me swing my weapon, although there's an enemy quite literally in my face trying to kill me dead. I wrote this off as just a one-off bug, but this would become a recurring pattern later in my playthrough. But the Phantom over here in Volcano Manor seems to activate, you know, a lot farther away this time. He just starts yapping about Rykard almost immediately. Also, Inquisitor Giza is called Torturer Giza instead. All of the Inquisitor references are Torturer in 1.0, which, you know, there's a subtle difference between the two once again, but Inquisitor, I guess, is a slightly nicer way of saying Torturer, I suppose. But yeah, Volcano Manor seemed pretty much the same here in this building. And then when we go around this area of the level, the Godskin Noble also seemed a lot more unpolished than the finished version of the game, but not anything crazy as far as different moves or whatnot. It seemed mostly the same. But when we get over to Rykard's arena, this is something that I noticed was immediately different. First of all, you can duplicate the Serpent Hunter. For some reason, I don't know why, pretty much every time you walk into this boss fight, it would give you another one, so that's most definitely a bug. But also, Rykard has a completely different name. In the current version of the game, his name is Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy. However, in the 1.0, his name is Rykard Recusant Shardbearer. That combined with the Torturer name change, I think it just, you know, gives a lot of different lore implications. There's actually no references to blasphemy in regards to Rykard at all in the 1.0 that I could find. Like, that's a word that's just not used entirely. So I think this is more just pointing towards Rykard being like the leader of the Recusants and that entire clan and whatnot. So Recusant Shardbearer is a much different thing to Lord of Blasphemy. So I just really wanted to point that out because that's one of the biggest boss name changes. Also, want to take note of the fact that his remembrance is called Remembrance of the the recusant instead. Of course, after defeating Rykard, I do what you gotta do, and you get the Blasphemous Blade, and I noticed right away that the effect is a little bit less good, to be honest. Like, it looks a bit more cheap and janky in this version, but also the actual wave that comes out of Blasphemous Blade is a lot faster than the current day version of the game. Like, it travels so quick, and it's not called Taker's Flames once again, it's just called Blasphemous Blade. And also I noticed that you don't really get the additional health just by killing enemies with the actual sword part. You have to use the L2 effect in order to get your HP back, but other than that, it seemed to function about the same. After that, I went on in Leyndell to go fight Morgott, and I watched the cutscene, and I think this was just my brain. For some reason, I thought this like fire effect that comes around his sword once the wood falls off it to reveal like his cursed sword, I thought that fire effect wasn't there in like the current day version of the cutscene, but I guess it is, and I remembered that incorrectly, so I was just wrong on that one. But what Morgott does have differently is, can you guess what theme is playing? You'll never, believe me lads, you'll never guess it. It's Malenia's theme, but also when he kills you, he has an additional line of dialogue that gets cut off before you can even finish it all the time. The game just cuts him off before he can finish talking, so I think it's interesting that a lot of these bosses have an additional line that usually doesn't appear in the main game, and for Morgott's, it's this one, but he seemed more or less the same moveset-wise. I couldn't tell any mechanical differences. I don't know, it could have been just placebo effect. He seemed a little more aggressive than usual. Also, I could tell that not all of the effects were totally polished, but really this fight seemed to be in shape for the most part. Now, you're gonna notice there's also a pretty big name change here. In 1.0, he's not Morgott the Omen King, he's Morgott Prince of the Omen, and his remembrance reflects that as well because it's Remembrance of the Omen Prince. I thought that was very interesting, and I'm not totally sure why the wording was changed on this to some degree. Maybe it fits in a little bit better with lore, but I thought that was interesting nonetheless. After you defeat him, Morgott automatically gives you his additional dialogue when he's laying down instead of optionally walking up to him and do it, so he just spits it off right away. And then when you go up to the Erd Tree, it gives you a different message than what it normally does, and I think the new one's better. It's a lot more descriptive, but this one was different. Melina has slightly different dialogue than what's spoken versus what's written on screen, so
Of the flame of ruin, then the impenetrable thorns can be burned away, and I can guide you down the path.
there must have been a different script at some point. This would lead us to the Mountaintop of the Giants, which is one of my least favorite areas in Elden Ring, so we're going to get through this one quickly. I didn't spend a whole lot of time here, I just did the main beats, and what I noticed is that in Castle Sol, what's crazy is that when you're trying to go fight Commander Niall for the Haligtree piece, the enemy placements in Castle Sol are different enough to where they become so annoying. For example, this Banished Knight will directly block the path you need to walk through the gate, and even if you successfully avoid them, guess what? This Banished Knight can get into the boss fight arena with you, and that on top of Commander Niall spawning 2 Banished Knights in already, you can have a total of 3 to deal with, plus the boss. Like, it's just, this shouldn't happen. It's completely broken. Obviously, this knight being able to enter the boss fight arena is a glitch, but the enemy placement is not, and I'm glad they fixed this because these 2 factors combined are just complete bull. This was one of my least favorite moments playing Elden Ring 1.0. I hated the Mountaintop of the Giants area. Also, when fighting Vike in the Everjail, pretty much all of the NPC fights, almost without exception, they all have 2 additional flasks, where in the current day version of the game, they can heal pretty much 1 time, but they could do it at least twice here, and these fights dragged on for a long time. I don't even think it really makes them harder. They're just a lot more tedious. So I'm very glad they changed that. But you might say, hang on a second, Chop. Mountaintop of the Giants isn't totally garbage. I mean, it has one of the most iconic Elden Ring weapons in the whole game. Rivers of Blood is literally just around the corner, and you know what? That was the one thing in front of me that was keeping me going, man. You know, it was like that, putting the shiny ball in front of the cat. That was me. I was about to get Rivers of Blood and about to go crazy, but to my immense disappointment, once getting Rivers of Blood, you realize that it doesn't come with Corpse Piler. It just comes with Bloody Slash, and that's it. There's an Ash of War in the game called Double Slash in 1.0 that effectively works like Rivers of Blood, but without the bleed part of it. So it's just like, why? What's even the point? Rivers of Blood sucks in 1.0. So I was very deflated after seeing this news, but I'm like, okay, I gotta go fight the Fire Giant, one of my least favorite bosses as far as main ones go. And getting into Fire Giant's arena, I noticed something right off the bat that I don't believe he does in the current day version of the game. He can do Burn O Flame in phase 1 here, which I'm pretty sure he doesn't in the current day version of the game. Like, I think this is exclusively a phase 2 move. Either that or it's just a lot more rare because I don't recall seeing it this much, but he was doing Burn O Flame a lot in phase 1, which kind of made the flow of that particular phase kind of clunky. Phase 2 was about the same, but he seems a lot more mobile. Like, he would roll around a lot. He's kind of like Elden Beast. As soon as you catch up to him, he'd be rolling to a different spot again, so kind of a pain in the ass. But other than being a lot more active, I couldn't tell any giant differences, you know, with the Fire Giant. So after defeating him, getting his remembrance, and moving on from this godforsaken area, we go up to the Forge and talk to Melina, where we burn the Erd Tree. And so once you spawn into the next area, the Crumbling Farm Azula, it's called something completely different in 1.0. This area is actually called the Doomed Farm Azula, which to me sounds a lot more badass. I like this name way more. The Doomed Farm Azula just sounds a lot more in character for Elden Ring and a lot more intimidating than Crumbling Farm Azula. It's not that it's a bad name inherently, I just like Doomed a lot better. And one of the craziest things I noticed in this area was I actually went to go finish up Alexander's quest line, and so once I get done battling him and get his talismans, they're called something way different, and the descriptions are so different too. You get like Alexander's remains and Alexander's core, and it talks about in the description it being like, you know, his like inner flesh and blood and insides. It's just almost degrading description of the talisman where, you know, it's a lot more like Shard of Alexander, Warrior Jar Shard, a lot more respectable in that way. But yeah, the description of the 1.0 one's a lot more graphic for some reason. I don't know why. To be honest, the enemy placement in the Doomed Farm Azula is just about the same as the current day version of the game, although I do feel like the Beastmen are a bit more aggressive in the 1.0. They're a bit tougher to deal with. All in all, this area seemed kind of unchanged. It was pretty much what I expected. However, when I got to the Godskin Duo, a curveball happened, something I didn't expect. Well, I didn't really have to fight a duo at all. I just had to fight one of them, pretty much. Like, I get in there, I kill the noble, and after I kill the apostle, I'm like waiting for the noble to spawn back in, but he just never does. It's only the apostle, and I just killed him over and over and over again until the fight was done. This had to be some kind of one-off glitch, but this fight was very buggy in the 1.0. I'm sure I'm not the only one. As I progressed further and further into the Doomed Farm Azula, I noticed a lot more enemy placements that are not how the current day version is, as well as a lot of different item placements as well. But I decided to check out Dragonlord Placidusax before going to fight Malekith, and as far as boss fights go, honestly, this one is a little bit more intact to the current day version than a lot of these ones we've discussed or have yet to discuss. But the thing with Placidusax I noticed was that his effects are a little bit unpolished, right? Like, these are clearly not as done, but also he could teleport almost as much as he wanted to consecutively without stopping, and that was incredibly frustrating to deal with. Usually in the current day fight, he'll do this teleport once, swing at you, and then he has at least a little bit of downtime where you can punish him, but he seemed to just be able to do whatever he wanted in this 1.0. And also, I noticed when you get a critical hit, the actual like critical spark is red instead of orange. Not really sure why, but it looks kind of cool. But everything else seemed pretty much the same. The remembrance is identical to the current day version, and then this would bring me up to the Great Bridge, and after defeating maybe the most annoying draconic tree sentinel in the entire game, I would finally have access to Malekith. So this is where things got interesting, because right away you can see that there's already a change in the name. In the current day version of the game, this boss is called the Beast Clergyman. This is Garank, and in this particular form, he's known as Beast Clergyman by the boss name. However, in the 1.0, his name is Beast Pastor, which I guess is kind of the same thing, but pastor has a little bit of a different connotation in like the English language, so I can guarantee you this is like a Japanese translation issue. But yeah, in the 1.0, his name is just Beast Pastor, although he seemed absolutely identical to the current day version as far as moveset and mechanics go. But when we get into phase 2 with Malekith the Black Blade, there was a couple of weird things. First of all, the Destined Death effect doesn't seem to actually have any visual icons. You know, in the game, when you get hit by one one of these moves, it kind of puts a gray bar over the top of your health. Like, obviously that's dead and you can't really recover that part at the moment, but that just doesn't exist here. It just like shortens your health bar and you can't really visually see what's going on. Same is true if you're using Destined Death, by the way. If you were to throw like a Destined Death slice at an enemy, you can't actually see like the cap that it takes off. It's kind of strange. But weirdly enough, he also has very different particle effects for Destined Death. You can see it has this sort of like purple neon glow, and it's, you know, not the correct effect, but it looks amazing. I kind of wish they kept this in because I love how this looks. It just adds a little additional flair to this boss fight, in my opinion. Also, the other kind of annoying thing about Malekith is that if you die to a Destined Death move in this fight, you actually spawn back at the Grace with that part of your health already taken away. So you spawn in with less than full health. This is like taking us all the way back to Dark Souls 2, basically. You have to rest at the Grace an additional time to get your full health back. So that is obviously a bug. But yeah, besides those weird oddities, Malekith seemed about the same. There's just a couple of bugs and obviously incorrect particle effects and a different name change. So there's a couple interesting things to note there, but this would officially bring us into the final endgame with the Ashen Capital. And before I went to go fight Gideon, I decided now it would be a great time to go battle Mohg and Malenia. So after getting both pieces of the secret Haligtree medallion, this would give us access to the Consecrated Snowfield area, which would then also give us access to the Haligtree itself, but also Mohg's palace. And so getting to the Consecrated Snowfield, I noticed something immediately because something was off visually about the map. There's a lot of these like arrows, and they seem to indicate elevation and maybe like how you traverse this area, and they're actually still there in the current version of the game, but they're a lot more muted and subdued, and there's just other detail on like the current patch of the game. So the Consecrated Snowfield felt a little different, even like lighting wise, but you had your standard changes in grammar and wording. For example, the Ordina Liturgical Town is actually called the Ordina City of Ceremony here, although when you actually spawn into it, it's still the Liturgical Town, so I don't really know why those two are different. That's a little bit odd, but getting here, one of the craziest things was that you guys know there is a cave that has another version of Astel. This is actually not the Natural Born of the Void, but Astel Star of Darkness. What was absolutely insane, number one, was this had different effects to the normal Natural Born Astel. You can tell that this laser is very unpolished, and then also I noticed that whenever this Astel was taking damage, it would duplicate itself, and it was absolutely terrifying. I really don't know what was going on here, but it was horrifying. When I was dealing damage to this, like 6 or 7 would spawn in around it and then just disappear. This jumping in and out of reality was absolutely horrifying, and it provided a totally different experience than fighting this boss in the main like current day version of the game. It's not the same at all. It's so clear that this Astel was not meant to be played yet. It was not finished whatsoever, and I think we kind of see the result of that. It was insane, but I mean, it felt like a brand new boss in a way, so that was cool. But as we continue to move through the Consecrated Snowfield, I noticed that there were not nearly as many items or rewards or chests or enemy placements that were quite different to the original as well. It's just a lot more of an empty feeling area. You know, I don't like Mountaintop of the Giants, and I don't love Consecrated Snowfield either. They kind of both have the same problem, but it's even more pronounced in 1.0. It just feels very barren and hollow and kind of unrewarding. But there's a couple things we got to do here. First of all, we needed to access Mohg's palace. So to do this, I went over to the back left side of this area, and after fighting the Sanguine Noble, which also has a lot more healing flasks, by the way, I finally opened the portal, and then we enter this brand new area. Mohgwyn's palace didn't have a whole lot to report on because the biggest differences were mostly just item placements and what you get as rewards. For example, when you get invaded by the White Mask, the only thing you get out of defeating this enemy is like a single pauper rune, which is like, you know, the worst one in the whole game. That's all you get in this version. It's not worth it whatsoever. And even exploring the rest of the caves and stuff, there's a lot of like Ashes of War and other abilities and runes and stuff that are there. But I will say it still is significantly more stripped down than the current version of the game. Like another thing that kind of felt unrewarding is all of the big lords and heroes runes that you find in this area, you know, some real like beefy ones. Many of them just don't exist. So you're not getting that extra boost in runes that you can keep and stuff. So it was a lot less fun and rewarding to explore this area again and collect stuff because there just simply isn't as much to do. But when we got to Mohg himself, the only actual difference to speak of, in my honest opinion, is he has an extra line of dialogue when he kills you.
Is mine and mine alone. For all
Now, at first, I was tempted to say they cut this line out for lore reasons. He says, for all eternity, which doesn't really make sense given the context of Shadow of the Erdtree, or it just wouldn't really fit that well. But at the same time, you know, given the track record of all of these bosses having an additional line that was cut in their fight, I'm not surprised they got rid of this one. It probably wasn't for lore reasons, or at least not the primary reason, but he does have an additional line when he kills you, which I thought was fascinating. But otherwise, I mean, his fight is mechanically identical. So then after defeating Mohg, collecting his remembrance, and then walking up to the arm and then being sad that I can't actually access the DLC because I'm playing the 1.0 and this game is unfinished, we actually decided to head back to the Consecrated Snowfield and go back to the Liturgical Town to do the little puzzle in order to enter the Haligtree. So to do this, you have to enter an Everjail, and getting in here, you have to light 4 different candles. This seemed about the same to me as well, like even how the Black Knife Assassin works, but what was different is that these Albinauric witch ladies have purple bows instead of blue. But for some reason, they don't all have purple. Like in the normal Outer World version of the Consecrated Snowfield, they have the normal color. It's only in this particular jail do they have this unique color. Also, I still hate these enemies, by the way. They're one of the worst in the game. But when I finally managed to get through this puzzle 4 hours and 6 beers later, I actually had access to the Haligtree teleporter, and then this would take me to this section of the game. And once I arrived here, I noticed that number one, you don't have nearly as many item placements, you know, like right when you spawn in behind you, there's something you can pick up, not here in the 1.0. Also, what's kind of strange is that, you remember back in Leyndell, we didn't have the bubble-blowing double baby enemies, and instead we just had those like weird imps. And you would think that maybe, oh, this enemy type hasn't been added to the game yet. Not true, because they're in the Haligtree, and you'll also notice that their bubble has a lot different of an effect. You know, it's more rainbow in the current patch of the game, but this is a lot more neon blue. As far as I could tell, they seem to function more or less the same. Perhaps these old ones do a bit more damage, but more or less they're identical. It seemed a lot easier traversing this area in the 1.0, to be honest, than it does in the current day version of the game. I'm not really sure why that is. There might be more enemies in the current Haligtree. I'm not totally sure about that, but yeah, the enemies were not quite as aggressive, and you can tell that the effect on their weapon is very different. I just think it's weird that they're not in Leyndell if they're already here in the Haligtree. That just doesn't make sense to me. Once I got to the actual main town part of the Haligtree, honestly, the enemy placements actually seem to be pretty much on point to the main current version of the game, as did Loretta, Knight of the Haligtree. That seemed just about an identical boss fight. Nothing crazy to report in this area, you know, maybe a couple items missing or rearranged here and there, but nothing insane. This would take us to the final leg of the Haligtree, and where I was incredibly disappointed, because at this point in my playthrough, I was looking to upgrade some of my weapons and go for the, you know, Ancient Dragon Somber Smithing Stones, and all of the locations that I know about in the Haligtree didn't have them. It would be like a different item, so I was so sad to not see these very crucial upgrade items be exactly where I know them, but they had been moved out of the Haligtree. This was a lot less rewarding for gathering equipment and upgrade materials and everything, and so I decided just to head straight for Malenia pretty much. Something weird I noticed was actually the entrance and the enemy placement to this door that leads into the Haligtree roots had different enemy types and placements, and this was a lot easier to traverse in the 1.0 than it is in the main game. It's kind of a pain in the ass getting through this section in the main version of Elden Ring. However, in 1.0, it was a breeze. These knights don't stalk you and track you down nearly as heavily as the current ones do, and so I kind of walked past this like it was nothing, and then this gave me access to the Lake of Rot. I know they've changed it to where you can sprint a lot faster through the lake in the current version of the game, but it completely slows you down in this one, so you gotta do that old trick where you kind of just like dodge backwards to get through this quickly, so that was a little bit frustrating. Such is the case with like literally every other area in 1.0. The Haligtree overall just wasn't nearly as rewarding to explore and pick things up and find items. It just was a lot more barren and hollow and just flat. But when I finally got to Malenia, I had heard some rumors that there was some big differences in this fight, and so I was excited for my journey of this, and I was not disappointed. Now let's have a real quick lesson on Malenia. Now, by no means am I a Malenia intricate detail expert, but I know a little more about this fight than the average player. However, I will say that in the normal current day version of the fight, Malenia more or less will do Waterfowl Dance typically twice, especially when she gets to about 20% health. You can almost guarantee one, but you're more or less able to rely on at least 2 Waterfowl Dances in Phase 1. However, in the 1.0 version of this game, I noticed that there's no rhyme or reason to her doing it at all. She'll do it whenever she wants. It can be her first opening move of the fight. You literally have no way to manipulate this or anything. She kind of just does it whenever. This was a very frustrating aspect to me because there was no kind of rhyme or reason to how the flow of the fight is supposed to go. Also, one of the most interesting things about this Malenia is that she has an attack that was cut from the main game, and I'm going to show it to you right now. It's like a walking waterfowl dance that I'm not really sure why this is a thing. A lot of people think this is like the original conception of the waterfowl dance, but the fact that she already has a completed version of that move and this like kind of janky looking one, granted this one is significantly easier to deal with and dodge. This is not a hard move to avoid at all, and even if you do get hit, it's not for a ton of damage. It's not like an instant game over like a normal waterfowl is, so it was a lot less scary. However, this move just looks bad, and I'm glad they got rid of it because it doesn't look good. But I couldn't really get her to do this in Phase 2, only in Phase 1. However, some of the differences in Phase 2 is that her waterfowl dance doesn't actually deal Scarlet Rot buildup for some reason. That was a nice added bonus, I guess, because if the waterfowl doesn't outright kill you, the Scarlet Rot usually would, so that's a little different. Also, she could pretty much use her Scarlet Bloom whenever she wanted, even twice in a row, which doesn't make any sense at all, but that was a very common occurrence in Phase 2. And then her cloning attack was a lot, or at least seemed significantly less threatening in the 1.0. It didn't seem to track as hard. The timing felt a little different as well, but overall, I found this move a lot easier to dodge in general. When defeated, she gives you the same remembrance. However, her weapon is actually called the Hand of Malenia instead, which is, you know, not too different, but it's notable. And if all that wasn't enough, she has an additional line of dialogue when she kills you.
Now do you understand? I am Blade of Mikala.
And while this isn't crazy different, she's not dropping some piece of insane lore with this extra additional line, but, you know, maybe it adds a little context or flavor to the fight. I don't really feel strongly either way about them cutting out this one, but again, that's like the pattern for most bosses. They had another line that they just scrapped, so this one got cut. But as always, after defeating Malenia, the hardest boss in Elden Ring uncontested, I decided to fight the second hardest boss in Elden Ring. Yes, that would be Gideon, the smart guy, the all-knowing. He knows a lot of stuff. For some reason, there's no Stake of Marika here, so you have to run all the way back if you die on Gideon, which is even more frustrating. Also, I'm not totally sure, but he doesn't seem to yap for as long on your first encounter, right? The first time you walk through that wall, he starts running his mouth for a while, and he's like, I knew you'd come, and then, you know, you can walk up to him and charge spells, or you can buff, you can do whatever, and get a giant hit on him while he's still talking. But you can only do that the first time you walk into this fight, because every time you walk, like, through the fog wall or whatever, the fight just immediately begins and he starts throwing spells. So you have one chance to really get it right, but I feel like he didn't actually talk for quite as long in the 1.0, or he got into the combat a bit more quickly. At least that's what it seemed like. As far as I could tell, he had the exact same selection of moves that he does in the current version of Elden Ring, but I felt like he used them at varying frequencies. For example, he was a lot more keen to use stuff like Blood Flame and Rykard's Rancor, which are, you know, some of the easiest moves to dodge and deal with, and he would rely on those a lot more heavily instead of stuff like his magic or his holy, you know, rings that are significantly tougher to dodge. Gideon just felt a lot easier. Also, like, his holy bubble that he can put around himself explodes instantly, and also he has 2 healing flasks instead of 1 that he does in the current game. And I think maybe they changed his AI a little bit to be a bit more aggressive in the current version of Elden Ring, but you know, he can't heal as much, so perhaps that was a trade-off. Either way, didn't really find Gideon to be too much trouble, and for some reason, for me, Gideon had no dialogue when I killed him, which I'm pretty sure he's supposed to, even in the 1.0, but he didn't say anything. Man just held that L and went silent. It was wild. Thanks for the armor, I guess. nerd. Going into Godfrey First Elden Lord, I wasn't really sure what I was expecting because every main boss to some degree has had some type of change, whether it's even just a name change or a slight mechanic difference, whatever. But I did know that Golden Shade Godfrey didn't seem to be much different mechanically, so I kind of felt the same would be here. And that was true, although when I was playing the fight, I was like preparing myself and expecting the phase 2 switch up, but it never happened. And I was like, what's going on? Like, I kept mentally thinking, I'm like, all right, I need one more hit and then it's going to kick into phase 2. Oh, I just need one more hit. And then it started to get to a point where I'm like, hold on, something's wrong. And yes, as you can tell, the biggest difference in the Godfrey fight is that they actually split it up into just 2 whole phases. In the current version of Elden Ring, once you get Godfrey to about like 45% health or so, he kicks into phase 2 and becomes Horaloo. But the boss fight health bar doesn't reset. However, in 1.0, Horaloo just gets a full health bar. Now, I'm not totally sure if they just rearranged the numbers of the health bar to kind of be equivalent to each other. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know if they just split it into 2 phases, but it's more or less the same health pool or not, because it did feel like maybe it had a little more health than usual. I can't be totally sure about that. Honestly, Horaloo is one of my least favorite main bosses. I think Godfrey's fine. I like the Godfrey part of the fight. I don't really like fighting Horaloo, so dealing with a full health bar just felt even psychologically kind of annoying. But that's the only mechanical difference as far as I can tell. The moveset was exactly the same as release Godfrey, but the other thing that's worth noting is that he also has an additional line of dialogue that got cut.
Was nobly fought. Thy rest is well deserved.
Once again, this line isn't really needed, so I don't think it's a big deal they got rid of it. However, it's just interesting having him talk a little bit more once he kills you. Also, when you defeat Horaloo, he lets out like this really crazy laugh, which never really felt in character for Godfrey or even Horaloo for that matter for me. Godfrey himself is super stoic, so it obviously wouldn't work there, and even you could argue Horaloo maybe is a little bit more unhinged and this would make sense, but even then, I don't really think it makes sense or is in character to go from literally the first Elden Lord to just laughing like he's the Joker. It was just a very strange character choice, and it kind of threw the whole vibe of the fight off, so I'm glad they got rid of this. But before we move on to Radahn and Elden Beast and then the end of the game, I want to talk about a couple of weird miscellaneous things that I noticed in the 1.0 compared to the current version. As far as I can tell, I don't think you can actually get Malenia's Great Rune in the 1.0, because in order to get to the isolated Divine Tower, you either have to go through Leyndell, and that gets burned up and gone when it becomes the Ashen Capital, or the other option is you have a chest in Limgrave called the Tower of Return that will take you to it, and normally in the main game or the current version this works fine, but in the 1.0 this chest gets opened once and then you cannot use it again, and even if you keep the chest shut and never use it until you want to get Malenia's Great Rune, it's just opened up by this point of the game and you can't actually get there. For some reason it just looks like they didn't want players going after Malenia's Great Rune in this Divine Tower in the 1.0. I don't really know why, but I haven't been able to get this to work. Also, the rune pickup hitboxes on all of these like stones and tombs and statues, they just simply don't work. They're so bad. You either have to get off your horse and jump on them and pick them up methodically one by one, which is incredibly tedious, or you just don't pick them up at all, which obviously, you know, if this was how it was in the main game, people would be over it and complaining, so I'm glad they fixed this. It was just kind of a hitbox issue, not really so good. Also, I did notice that enemies can very commonly get into rooms that they're not supposed to be in, and very frequently, just like Volcano Manor, they could get into a room where you cannot swing your weapon, but they would still try to kill you. Also, when traveling to this site of Grace, it doesn't actually spawn you at the fort in Limgrave, like it doesn't put you on the Grace, it puts you right in front of the giant like Star Scourge pit in the ground. I guess they wanted you to like clearly see this more so you don't miss it. I don't really know, but it puts you pretty far from the Grace that you wanted to spawn at. It's kind of strange. When it comes to Ashes of War and abilities and skills, there was many name changes and some kind of weird ones as well. So in the current version of the game, you have the icon on the left side of your screen that tells you what the ability or skill of your weapon art or Ash of War is, right? And when going into the description of your weapon, it would match what's the icon on screen. They would be the same thing. However, in the 1.0, you could have a certain name of a skill in the left side of the screen, and then that could be called something totally different in the weapon skill inside the menu. Like, they're different names. It was very confusing. I didn't know what was going on here. In the current version of the game, they made this uniform. They're one and the same, thank God, but in 1.0, this was a mess. In 1.0, there are also quite a few broken Stakes of Marika where if you try to respawn there, it could completely, like, get you caught in a death loop, which was incredibly annoying. Either that or there would just be no Stakes of Marika at places, like, especially at Gideon. The quest lines, for the most part, seemed to be intact, although they definitely lacked polish, I would say. The music was also all over the place, as I've pointed out. Like, there would be the wrong tracks for enemies, ones that just didn't fit at all. I know a lot of this music was placeholder, and they were probably waiting for specific tracks to get finished, so they would just throw something in as a workaround, but still, playing the 1.0 is pretty shocking in that regard. Also, the shaded castle, you can see all of this poison, like, rock texture around the arena just is not finished. Like, it's just untextured. It looks like snow. This area in the Deeproot Depths were the most visually clear representations of the 1.0 just simply not being a finished product, and I tried everything, reloading the Grace, even restarting and reloading my game. Nothing actually fixed this, which pointed to me that this texture simply just wasn't done, so it looks very strange in this build. The Dragon Ezekis has like this scarlet rock cloud that lasts for like 8 years, which, you know, it's supposed to linger, but clearly not this long. It's kind of absurd in 1.0. I'm glad they changed this. Now, I could be here for 8 hours documenting every single little grammatical change or item description name change or what have you. There's a lot of those to play. If you really want to see those, I'll leave a link in the description to a Google Doc where you can see all of them, or you can just play the 1.0 for yourself. However, let's talk about the final boss of the game, Radahn and Elden Beast. Right when you pass through that fog wall, your attention is not actually on Radahn himself, but on the big giant text pop-up that says Stone Platform, which, you know, normally doesn't come up in the current day version of the game, especially when you're just starting this fight. That is not supposed to happen right here, but Radahn seemed the same mechanically. I honestly couldn't tell a single difference in his moveset or how he goes about using them. When you get into phase 2 and you fight Elden Beast, the transition has no music for Elden Beast spawning, which just kind of felt awkward, and it didn't really set the tone of the fight correctly. But once you actually get in here, there were quite a few changes with Elden Beast. First and foremost, he is a lot more squirmy and he moves around so much in 1.0. Not only does he move around way too much and he's so much more squirmy, but he's an absolute masher as well. He is just constantly spamming attacks. There's almost no downtime, and in the downtime that there is, he's usually moving to the other side of the arena anyways. And not having Torrent to make that traversal somewhat more manageable, I wanted to just absolutely uninstall life. It was a nightmare. Elden Beast was one of my least favorite boss fights in 1.0, and now I remember why. His attacks also seem to do quite substantially more damage than they do in the current day version of the game. Like, what we have now is fine, but he's definitely a more mellowed out version of Elden Beast. I just don't think he's a good boss, and in 1.0, he's pretty awful. But you get the remembrance like really quickly after you defeat him, and then you get teleported back to the stone platform, and when you come back here, guess what? It plays the Limgrave theme. Kind of takes the end of the game vibes out of it a little bit, if I'm being honest, but when you do the ending, the crazy part is the cutscenes themselves are surprisingly intact and identical, minus a couple of different timing changes to some of the cuts. The cutscenes are the same, and nothing really to speak on about that. However, when the credits start rolling, the music is actually like the Godskin theme, and for some reason, at some point during the credits, the track will begin to stop, and then another one will play on top of it, so you'll have looping tracks that kind of go and clash with each other. Just sounds really strange and awkward. Once again, I think it's just a placeholder song. I mean, obviously it's a placeholder, but I think that they just needed to put something that more or less fit the vibe until they had the final song ready for this moment. But you can get the credits to roll with just a completely incorrect song, and it kind of makes the game feel a little bit silly in that way. But the 1.0 experience was very fascinating, and I don't know if anybody else on the internet is interested in watching this. I don't know if anybody's watching this video, but regardless regardless, I wanted to just document these changes just for my own sake, because I find this stuff just personally incredibly fascinating. I hope you guys found this interesting too. If you want to check out the Google Doc that has like all of the documented changes, if you're into that, I would recommend go reading that. However, I wanted to cover all of the major and important and standout ones in this video and showcase to you how different 1.0 Elden Ring is compared to what we got now. Like, it's not even the same game at all. This gives you a real peek behind the curtain to what they were probably thinking and cooking up at FromSoftware, and that's not even to really touch on the lore aspects of this. You know, again, Saint Trina being much more prevalent, I noticed, and a bunch of other implications for the lore that really shift the perspective and the tone of what's going on in the story of Elden Ring. You can really deep dive into that, but I think all of these changes for me was a personally very rewarding experience to play, and it does make me appreciate what they've done to update and patchwork Elden Ring as the years have gone on. But it's one of my favorite games of all time, and kind of seeing where it came from was super rewarding for me to do. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. This was a giant project for me to take on, but one of my favorites. So if you guys enjoyed it, just show me by dropping a like and subscribing to the channel. If you want to consider it, it's completely free. I would greatly appreciate it, and you'll see some more stuff like this. Either way, I just want to say thank you for your time and spending it watching this, and let me know what you thought the most fascinating change in the 1.0 version of Elden Ring was. I would love to know your thoughts below, but have a good one, guys. Take it easy, and I'll see you in the next one.